For the first keynote speech section, we are honored to have Professor Marilyn as one of the keynote speakers. Before we give the floor to Professor Fleer, I'll pass the mic to my partner Jenny to introduce Professor Fleer to you.
Thank you, Vivian. Laureate Professor Marilyn holds the Foundation Chair of Early Childhood Education and Development at Monash University, Australia. She was awarded the 2018 Kathleen Fitzpatrick Laureate Fellowship by the Australian Research Council and was a former president of the International Society of Cultural Historical Activity Research. Additionally, she holds the position of an honorary research fellow in the Department of Education, University of Oxford, and a second professor position in the Kindergarten Node Center, Western Norway University of Applied Sciences, and has been bestowed the title of honorary professor at the Danish School of Education, Aarhus University, Denmark. She was presented with the 2019 Ashley Goldsworthy Award for Outstanding Leadership in University Business Collaboration and was recently elected as a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences.
Today, she will share with us joyful STEM learning through play. Along the presentation, if you have any questions or comments to Professor Fleer, please feel free to use the Q&A chat box. However, due to the time limit, we will select the most relevant ones to address later in a discussion session. Thank you a lot for your kind understanding. May I now invite Professor Marilyn Fleer to deliver her speech. Professor Fleer, please.
Good morning, everyone. It's a delight to be here. I'm hoping you can hear me. Excellent. I will now share my screen. And I'll just check, can you all see my screen adequately? I'm hoping so. I'll just continue. It's an absolute pleasure to be speaking to you this morning. Congratulations on hosting such an exciting conference and program. And I'd like to acknowledge YCCECE and the sponsors of this event. I feel incredibly honoured to be presenting to you. And I so enjoyed watching the Jumpstarter video. That's so inspiring. I hope you all felt the same way as me in watching the children, the families and the teachers engaged so wonderfully in STEM learning and STEAM conversations later on. I want to also acknowledge, before I begin my presentation, the Australian Research Council. I have funding from the council until 2024 to do a whole lot of research, some of which I will be sharing with you today. And I also want to acknowledge the amazing teachers that I've worked with to construct the research translation work that I'm sharing with you today. So I'm hoping you will enjoy that part of it. I also want to acknowledge my colleagues, Dr. Liang Li. Liang and I have done a lot of research in China in relation to the model that I'm sharing with you today. But the model I'm sharing with you today is a little different to what Liang and I have done together. And also acknowledge my PhD student, Yuju Wang, who did the translations on the videos for me. So with that, I'd like to share with you what we will be covering this morning in this short period of time that I'll be presenting to you. As the title that was announced, I think by Vivian, that it's about joyful STEM learning and early childhood that we're exploring today. So it was wonderful to see the Jumpstarter material on the screen beforehand, because I think what I'll be sharing with you lines up so nicely with what is already being shared and in Hong Kong. So wonderful. What I'll be doing is talking about some of the international research around all of the different kinds of models of teaching in the area of STEM, but I'm specifically going to, because it's quite vast, and because of the time frame, I'm just going to share with you about the models around science. But I have similar work that's been done on engineering and also technologies generally. So there's more work that sits under what I'm sharing with you, but I'm just going to highlight some that relates to the area of science. I'm going to talk about an idea, a concept that I've been working with called learningful play. You will all be familiar with playful learning. And of course, that's the term that's used a lot in a lot of literature and has so since 2006, 2007. But this year, I've been thinking about this and I'm hoping you'll see what I mean here, but it's this notion of learningful play as opposed to playful learning. So something to ponder. I don't know how that's working with the translation. So maybe it doesn't work in translation. Maybe you need to use the English terms to get the nuancing of it, but let's go through the presentation. And my presentation is for you to be thinking about this as we go through. So I'm going to set a few little problems for you to think about. And I encourage you to put in the chat some of your thoughts to share with each other, because then it becomes much more dynamic interaction through this format. And I'm going to then, as part of my presentation, talk to the idea of the stages of curriculum planning, where I'm of course, drawing on the curriculum document that you have. And I do know that that's probably in the process of being redeveloped because it's been around for some time. We have a similar situation in Australia. We are also in the process of redeveloping our curriculum, but nevertheless, we work with what we have at the time. And so my connections will be with your curriculum as it presently stands. And then I'm going to finish with some next steps. And I'm hoping to invite some of you to be part of our international research. So, and I'll talk more about that at the end. So that's the overview of what we're going to do. Of course, as I mentioned, I want to acknowledge the curriculum that you're working with. And as part of putting forward joyful learning, we're going to have a look at this, the whole notion of the how in the context of child-centered planning and of course child-centered curriculum development that you have, and this child-centered approach has been very much part of what you presented actually through the video even, and what you're seeking to achieve over an extended period of time. And it's very exciting to see from 2017 to now the kind of developments that are occurring in Hong Kong. So I congratulate you on that. But what I'm going to present today will fit with this, because what I want to is say that when we're thinking about STEM and we're thinking about playful learning, and we're thinking about even what is play, as many of you will know, there are many definitions of play internationally, and I'm sure even many definitions of play in Hong Kong that teachers are working on and working with. And so I wanted to share with you, first of all, as a backdrop to what I'm sharing, my perspective on that. And I draw very much on a cultural historical tradition, theoretical tradition about what is play. And that's where imagination is really important. And of course, imagination, wandering, creativity is all part of problem solving, inquiry, playful thinking, playful learning, learningful play. So a little dropping it in there for the moment, is very much a part of that 21st century thinking. But what's special about play is it's not just an activity that children do. It's not only a attitude, as we saw on the video, an approach to exploring the environment, but actually it also has a rich psychological basis, because imaginary play is a huge dimension, psychological function of imagining, like memory, will, self-regulation. The psychological functioning of imagination is something that develops from infancy, as we know, and we create the conditions as teachers to support that development, and of course families as well. And what I mean there specifically from a cultural historical tradition is that we'll look, of course, different in different cultural communities and different families even, and different societies. But when a child takes an object and imagines it to be something else to what they see, this is really, really important dimension of thinking about how a child uses a concept, a STEM concept, and imagines things that they can't physically always interact with. So thinking about the night sky, thinking about the solar system, thinking about the tiniest objects in our world, and particularly, of course, we've had a global pandemic. So thinking about what that means also, why are people wearing masks and being very careful? Because we can't see these viruses. So these things have to be imagined. So that's why play is so important and so central to children's learning, not just as an activity, but as a psychological function. And that's really the essence of the research I've been doing. But of course, that kind of development of the psychological function of imagination, where children go from imagining something that they see to be something else, to thinking and working with concepts, requires us as teachers to plan very carefully how we create those conditions. And the Jump Starter is a beautiful example of supporting teachers and families to do that. But what I'm going to share with you also is how what we know from the literature, as I promised I would at the beginning when I gave the overview. So what is it that we know about those models of teaching STEM, and particularly with a focus on science? What is it that we know from the research? So I'm going to share with you a very densely packed set of slides now, which haven't been translated, but this work has been published. So if anybody is interested, please let me know, and I will definitely share this work with you. So what I want to share is this first column here. So you'll see I have 3 columns that I'm sharing today. When we're thinking about a curriculum and a child-centered approach as the goal to learning in STEM, what do we know from the research generally? Now, I've just put some examples here, but what we know is that there are models of setting up learning, and I want you to reflect on your own curriculum, but also if you're very familiar with the Jump Starter materials and booklets and framework, I want you to be thinking, where might that be located in what I'm going to share with you now? Does it fit within some of these columns? So, and you might pop your thinking into the chat. That would be great if you did, and begin that interaction. If we're thinking about this very first column here, there are many models around internationally and research that's been done based on those models. And you can see I've highlighted a few examples there. But what that clustering of models shows is spontaneous play with opportunities for learning concepts, and in this case, science. And these models foreground the child as the driver of their own learning. And we as teachers in these models are responding to what the children are curious about, how they are engaging and wondering about. And so we are like the respondents to the children when we adopt some of these kinds of models. And you'll see Denmark, Switzerland, Belgium have very much created models around that and have done research in that area. So that's one example, but that's one characteristic of the models of how to be teaching STEM effectively. So these models do show effectiveness, but these models show effectiveness in relation to studying the child's agency as the author of their own science or STEM learning. Then there's another cluster of studies around the world that have been done, and these are rather interesting because I've loosely clustered them together because they create some sort of simulation of the science world. So either a science laboratory or a science scene, such as forensic science. And you'll see in the first example there by Howard, where she's used, and I assuming you know some of these stories, or singing games. So we're going on a bear hunt. There's a beautiful book about that, but there's also a song about that. We're going on a bear hunt. And so there's this rhythm to that. We can't find something and we go over and we go under. So there's this lovely rhythm. And what she's done is used what is already available in early childhood settings, to create a narrative, and in her case, with the research that she's done, a crime scene, and where forensic science was needed to work out who left the footprints at the crime scene. So that's an example of this area of imagining and imaginary play that's created. So where imagination is foregrounded. And these models are also, you'll see that I've also have my name in there, scientific play worlds. And I've put it into this spot in the clustering, because in the scientific play worlds, and you'll see examples shortly of this, if you haven't seen it already with previous presentations that I've given or looked at some of my work, the story becomes the important part of the beginnings of the problem that might arise. And it's slightly different to Howard's work, where the crime scene is created, so the problem is introduced through an activity. This is more to do with the crime scene, not a crime scene, but more to do with choosing children's books. And we're going to look at some examples from this one. An Enemy is Not the Enemy, which is a beautiful story about a symbiotic relationship. And I'll tell you more about that in a little while. But it begins with a story. So the research that I've done over 10 years has drawn on children's books. So you can kind of hear the STEAM dimension coming out here, but the focus is very much on how do STEM concepts support children's investigations, their play investigations, in relation to either a simulation of some kind, such as Howard's work. We also see similar things where in Finland, examples of acting as if scientists exploring experiments in the science laboratory, or we see it through books. But what you can hear through these examples is that the teacher has a very active role, not just in planning. There still is a lot of very much child-centered nature of what's being planned, because the children have agency, and the children are acting as if scientists, or as if characters in the story investigating a problem that's arisen. So that's kind of how they're clustered. But what is foregrounded is imagination. So you see the nice link I made with 21st century thinking, and how concepts have to be imagined. And so we need to develop the psychological function of imagination alongside of introducing the science concepts. Then what we have is this third category of science, or models of teaching. And again, think about where might Jumpstart a program sit. Could it sit in this one, or could it sit in the previous one? Or does your particular teaching approach sit in this area? So there are examples here where this is much more, the problem is much more directed by the teacher, and there's two parts to this, where in some cases teachers will provide materials such as the Primrose model of teaching science. So providing toys with prompted science questions. What happens if, or what happens when, or what can we see happening here? Type of questions from the teacher. And so it's still very child-centered, but the focus is not so much on the children's questions, although it could be, because the children will ask questions after they've noticed things. But the focus begins very much with something that's provided that sets up this potential for going forward. Blake and Howard have also looked at this area as well, and they found that teacher-child interactions during free play supported wandering actually gives high levels of problem solving. So there is some evidence to say this is really a good way to take this forward. But most of these models in this latter area, the problem or the question is usually introduced to the teacher by the teacher, and the children have to imagine or encouraged to ask questions, which then come from the materials. They're guided by the materials. So it's a somewhat different categorization. But I did this categorization to show you how the role of the teacher and the position of the child changes based on what model of teaching you adopt. But if we break this all down and have a look at it as a continuum, not as a continuum of right from wrong, but just a continuum of the place of the teacher and the place of children in this model. And so we can see spontaneous play with everyday science opportunities. And in some of the video content I saw that you would have seen too, you could see examples of that where the everyday play activities in the classroom or the centre are giving opportunities for engineering to happen in the block area, for instance. But again, that's sort of at this one end, and you can see children as authors of their own play and scientific learning, to imaginary scientific play situations that drive the need for learning science concepts. So the imaginary situation motivates the children to want to learn the concepts so that they can solve the problem. To thinking about imagining being scientists as if we are scientists, so very still much in the play mode, to exploring materials and toys to generate questions or potential inquiries, through to a problem or a question being introduced by the teacher, and the children are imagining what might be the solution. So it gives this kind of, if you like, child-initiated playful learning through to more teacher-initiated learning, as we can see in this example. So where I want to take you now is that if we look at what's going on internationally as well, I mentioned at the very beginning, if we're thinking about what's known internationally, a lot of writing has been around child-initiated imaginary play and also playful learning. And I've just popped up some very famous people who have been driving this, particularly if they've taken the work further into areas of sustainability as well. So some really important work that's being done there. But if what we are thinking now in relation to the idea of playful learning, on the right-hand side, you see that I've got that written there. The idea of learning for play, kind of sitting with this joyful STEM learning context as I see it. And and you see the playful learning at the bottom, and on the other side, the child-initiated imaginary play. So where I want to take us to is in this top bubble, and I want to take you there because it is an example to add to your toolkit, because different science or STEM problems demand different kinds of models, and different groups of children need different kinds of support. So we, as teachers, we need to draw on the research, the evidence, and have in our toolkit in evidence-informed practices, but also have more than one approach, because every learner is very different as well. And so I'm going to take you into this space now, in relation to introducing to you what you see on the left-hand side, which are the characteristics of a conceptual play world for learning for play. And where we're going to go with this is that we're going to look at it in relation to the kind of stages of curriculum planning that you already are very familiar with. And where we want to land is thinking about what I'm sharing now in a stepped planning approach. But what I'd like you to be thinking about as I share this planning approach, be thinking about how does this look when it's actually implemented in my classroom or my centre? How does it look in an integrated way where we're bringing the science, the technology, the engineering and the mathematics, and maybe the arts together, but also how does this look as something that is like the wheels of an engine moving a vehicle forward. So how is it actually propelling forward, not as a stepped approach? That's the planning that I'm going to introduce to you, but how does this look when it's being implemented holistically, when children are responding? So again, pop your thoughts into the chat if you have some. But we're going to begin. You'll see that I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the around about the middle of your diagram. And I'm going to begin this whole process by taking you back to this book of the An Enemy is Not the Enemy. That's the book that's going to be illustrated as part of the planning process. And what I'm going to do is just share with you a video clip of this first characteristic of a conceptual play world, selecting the story, and this is the story. And you'll hear the teacher talking about why she selected this particular story. And that fits in with your way of looking at the context and thinking about the planning in relation to the context in which you're working. Now, the context in which Sharina, the name of the teacher, Sharina was working was that different to Hong Kong, in Australia, 6-year-olds is that the kindergarten program for 6-year-olds is actually in a school setting. And Sharina in particular is working as a STEM specialist in her school. So this might fit with some of you who have STEM specialists. And what she does is she's introducing STEM to all of the children in the school, but I've chosen, and we have many more examples, I've chosen the example of the children who are 6 years of age, so it mirrors more closely the context in Hong Kong for this particular cohort. So let's have a look at Sharina talking about what book she chose and why she chose it. And you'll hear her talk about the fact that it was early in the year. Well, she'll talk about the children transitioning into the school and why this book actually set up a really personally meaningful science problem for these children, because they had started school and they didn't know each other necessarily. And of course, we know self-regulation, emotional expression, perseverance, all of those kinds of executive function practices are very important for school success. And we'll see that she talks very much about some of those dimensions in relation to selecting the story. So let's hear from Sharina how she went about, and you'll hear the details of selecting a story through this example.
We started by reading the story, Anemone is Not the Enemy by Anna McGregor. Simple pictures but beautiful illustrations that have quite a lot of emotion in the drawings themselves. The anemone, he was quite lonely. His interactions with other creatures hadn't been good because being an anemone, he would sting other creatures and they didn't want to come near him, but he was always looking for friends. Being able to use that story, especially with the junior primary students that are also developing friendships and learning how to feel safe at school and with other people, and having, I guess, what is a symbiotic relationship where you help each other, mutually beneficial, and I guess, yeah, developing those relationships.
So that was an example of her selecting a story. So that was the planning around that. Now we're going to hear from her in relation to, because you're probably thinking, oh, I know about symbiotic relationships, but actually, what did she do? So what we're going to hear next is Sharina talking about how she planned the imaginary play world, the STEM play world. And then, so that's characteristic 2, designing an imaginary space where the children jump into the story and learn about symbiotic relationships. So let's hear from her again.
The rock pool was an easy, I guess, simple setup, but fun and imaginative, and so enabling you to swim into the big ocean, and then there's some creatures there to help us feel safe and that we get to know It's that removal from the classroom and an imaginary world that we've created that actually sort of sets the scene, I guess. Their imagination can sort of go wild when they're out in the ocean, in the rock pool.
So from designing that space, now you can see visually what she did. Now she's going to talk to us about how the children together enter and exit the conceptual play world. And why that's particularly important is that it's very in keeping with the research that Liang Li and I did in China, specifically mainland China, on the importance of the whole group experiencing the conceptual play world together. And I'll talk a little more about that later from our research. So let's hear Sharina again. It's a very short piece.
To signal us entering the ocean, we said we're going to go for a swim and we're going to enter the ocean. We swam through some seaweed and now we are a creature that lives in the sea, and played as our characters and discovered things that were in the ocean and part of our play too. And then returning back into the STEM room to sort of make that definition.
And this takes us now to what is actually pivotal to a conceptual play world. So it's not just the experiencing of those things that we see that Sharina's talking us through in terms of the planning for this, but now the planning that goes into the play inquiry and the research that's needed by her to create authentic learning experience. So those children are living the problem, building empathy for the characters in the story, because they're worried about friendships of the two, because the story is very much about friendships. And so we'll hear from Sharina now about how she does that. And then we're going to look at the last clip where she talks about her role in the actual play inquiries.
Through the story, we had discovered that the clownfish and the anemone have a very special relationship, which is called a symbiotic relationship, where it's mutually beneficial for the two creatures that share that relationship. And as we were playing in the rock pool in our conceptual play world, we discovered a message from the clownfish and the anemone that they wanted to find out some more symbiotic relationships, some other relationships that were similar to theirs. And so we decided we needed to help them. We left our play world and we re-entered our STEM room. We discovered that we might need a little bit of help to answer that question. So we made a video call to our friend Dr. Daniels, who's a marine ecologist, and he was very helpful when he spoke to us about what a marine ecologist does, but also about a special symbiotic relationship that he knew about, which was the shark and pilot fish. The shark provides protection to the pilot fish, and they also allow the pilot fish to eat their scraps. The kids were very excited to learn about that relationship, and then we needed to work out a way to communicate what we had learned about that symbiotic relationship with the clownfish and the anemone. And we had some wonderful ideas. We needed waterproof paper and we needed a water postie that would deliver our mail. And in the end, we drew some pictures of what we had learned, and some children wrote letters and made books. And then we needed to put our wetsuits on and we swam back out to the ocean, posted our letters into their letterbox so that the clownfish and the anemone could also share the information that we'd found.
So that takes us to the last characteristic that of the conceptual play world for planning, and that's the role of the teacher, being inside the imaginary play with the children. So let's hear from Sharina, and then I have a few things that I wish to discuss.
Being involved in the play and being a clownfish myself, I often would have some clownfish swimming with me, but also then students feeling comfortable to swap characters if they wanted to. As the play developed, we had some going, I'm going to be a shark now. And you go, okay, that's great. So playing along with you, start chasing me because you're a shark and you want to chase the little clownfish, or I'm an anemone, I'll keep you safe. So having that, they understand that relationship, and being in the play yourself, you can encourage those those students that are a little bit more reluctant, that are a little bit hesitant to play, or perhaps don't know how they're going to do that character, that you can work together and play that character. As teachers, we observe the play and we watch what's happening and we scaffold, but I think being in the play actually is much richer in terms of developing the children's play and their ability to get involved and become a character, because you're doing it, so I can do it too.
And that takes us to the end of Sharina's exposition on her planning. And I'm hoping that I could see there's 19 comments in the chat, so that's great. I'm hoping that's all in relation to the content here. What I want to do is now just pull this together, because we have still some minutes. And what's very significant from our research is, and you can see on the screen here now, the 5 characteristics, that planning characteristics. What we've been learning from our research. The first thing we've been learning is that the teachers begin with thinking about what might be the book that relates to a particular science idea or a technology idea, and so on. And what we've learned is that actually teachers, when they begin this process, so if you're a pedagogical leader in your school, in your classroom, in your kindergarten, this may well be the case for you as well. What we've learned from our research is that the teachers go from being concerned about which book do I choose, to thinking about what is the science concept or the STEM concept that I really want to explore with my children, then to what knowledge do I need to actually be able to teach this? What STEM knowledge do I need? Do I need to know, all about symbiotic relationships, all of the ones in the world? What is it? Where is the boundary in relation to the problem that's being explored? How much knowledge do I need? And then finally, where teachers land in our research is that they go through all of those iterations to the most exciting space, where they're not necessarily thinking about those things, but they're thinking about what is the authentic problem that actually will motivate the children to want to learn the STEM concepts. And that's, you can probably hear, is a much higher order way of thinking about our own pedagogical practices. So you can imagine in this context, with this story, Sharina found ways that she could bring in the STEM knowledge that she needed by bringing in a marine biologist. Of course, she actually knew the concepts, but she wanted to bring forward, how do you plan something that's very authentic for the children? And as you heard at the very beginning, when she was talking about choosing the book, what book to choose, she was really looking at the context of those children entering school, thinking about friendships, thinking about fitting in. How do we help each other in our classroom? How do we build that cultural community so together we learn beautiful things? And so all of that was really important in selecting the book. And so you can see that she was very much at this top end, if you like, of thinking about and reflecting on practices, which was, what's the authentic problem that needs to be solved? And so she cleverly introduced the problem by putting you saw in the video, the problem on a piece of slate that could be found when they were swimming around. So it's a very, the examples that I've given are very much based on what we've learned from our research around how teachers develop their own practices when they begin with a small pop-up play world. So what I mean by a pop-up play world is it can be just done in one very short session, through to each day or once a week, depending on if you have timetabled for this or whether it's integrated. So whatever your practice is, there are many ways that you can do this. So you can begin with a small, instead of just a story session, you actually have a session around visiting an enemy in the ocean, meeting the problem and potentially solving it very quickly. or going each day into the ocean and meeting new problems that need to be solved. And therefore that takes longer. So that might take a week, it might take a month, it may be that it's done all term, and depending on the complexity of the story. So chapter books, for instance, each chapter can present a new problem that arises. Or the teachers can create their own stories, so traditional stories, and but that becomes like the glue that connects all of the children together as part of the collective exploration and wandering and curiosities and jumping into that story and being the characters. So that planning cycle is to recap it, is selecting a story that's dramatic. It needs some sort of problems, potential for a problem to arise, something that's very dramatic. Then once the book is chosen, what might be the space that's created in the classroom or outside that becomes the imaginary play world for jumping into the story and being those characters. Then some sort of routine, planning some sort of routine about how we go in and out of it, so that we're signaling to the children we are in that imaginary play world. And you saw Sharina, of course, just use the door frame and put streamers down it, so it was a simulation of seaweed, swimming through the seaweed with the wetsuits on, of course imagining they had the wetsuits on. But significantly, Sharina planned very carefully what might be the problems. And why that really matters is that in thinking through what might be the problem, you're thinking through how do you introduce the problem. And you saw the example of Sharina's, but there could be that a telephone message is left from if it's a different kind of book that says introduces the problem through a phone call. One of the characters has left a message on the school phone to say, the kindergarten phone, to say they need help. And that's always why building empathy for the characters in the story is wonderful, because once the children are connected to the characters in the story and they really enjoy that book, it's very easy to then set up problems where the characters need help with something and the children are going to help them. So they have to do some research as part of that. And that can be, as you saw with Sharina, bringing in somebody to support that process. It can also be using YouTube to do some research, going to the library to find books, interviewing parents, creating surveys. You know, there's all sorts of different things that can happen, depends on the problem that has been set. And finally, to say that fifth characteristic that really matters is around what role the teacher takes. One of the things we've learned with our research is that when teachers become a character in the story, this is not a straightforward process, because they go from being the teacher at the front or physically, because in some classrooms, even in kindergarten classrooms, the teachers are controlling everything, or moving from that, or where they are setting up the problems always, moving through to being a play partner is a very different position. So, but because teachers in Australia and in Hong Kong, you actually have pairs of teachers and more in early childhood settings in kindergarten. So one teacher can be with the children, helping the children along, learning along with the children. And I saw that in your video of the Jump Starter program too, that you can, one of the teachers, one of the professors mentioned that was a very important part, to be learning along with the children about some of the concepts. So the teacher can position him or herself as a co-learner, but one of the other teachers could be in character as the wise owl or some other character that presents the ideas, the information in some way, or supports them in the research. And then they're in what we call the above position. They're back in the teacher role, but they're through a character. So, but then there can be other positions where the teacher and the children are together, sort of in like a primordial we position, where together the youngest child might be holding the hand of the teacher and just watching what is going on, and not necessarily doing the activities, but just being with the teacher so that they feel they're part of the play and be watching what they're learning. And we know that that works really well in multi-age groups too. That's been part of our research. But anyway, these are the 5 characteristics that have become important part of our research that's come from 10 years of building the model, and now we're testing the model in different cultural communities. We're working together with teachers from different age groups, different regions, different parts of the world. And we've been working with families and in family daycare settings as well, where there is an educator who is not child-minding, but actually creating a program for children in their home. So we have different ways that we do this. But what, at the essence, to pull it together, is to say the conceptual play worlds research that we're currently doing, we've really today looked at, as you can see, what is the joyful STEM learning of early childhood. And this is our research is showing this is a very engaging way to teach STEM concepts to children. And the motivation of the children is so high that the teachers become extremely motivated to be with the children and continue these conceptual play worlds. So our research is showing that this continues. It doesn't die out after people have tried out the ideas. And the children are so motivated that motivation motivates the teachers, which is also really exciting. We've also learned that and we talked about that today, as you probably noted, the model sits sort of round about the middle of from child agency through to teacher-centred, so child-centred to teacher-centred. It sits in the middle, and it's not to say that STEM should be taught always like that, but this is one of the tools available to teachers to teach STEM concepts. And to take you back to learning for play, I'm hoping that this has now made a little more sense. So rather than playful learning, which is can be much more game oriented, not necessarily, but the focus on playful learning is different to learning for play. So here we're saying that the play is really important, and in the play they are learning. And so this is a kind of way to bring out this conceptual play world idea. And we've looked at, through those examples of Sharina, the stages of curriculum planning. But next steps. So what I'd like to do is invite you in closing to be thinking about what book do you have, or what story that is characteristic of your community that could be the essence of a play world that you could design, that you could try out next week. What might be the space? So if you've chosen your book, thinking about a story that you love and you know the children love, and even if it doesn't have a STEM concept in it, it doesn't have to have one, it's about the drama of what space would those children then go into to be part of this design conceptual play world? What part of your kindergarten would you change into that play world? How would you enter it as a collective to jump into the story and be those characters? And then what might be the problem that arises? So maybe they've role-played being the characters in the story on the first day, and the second day they go back into the play world and they find a problem. You know, the character needs help with something, and the way they need help is in relation to exploring a really powerful STEM concept. And then what would be then the research that the children would be doing to take back into the play world to help the character? So they go off and do some research. They might make a poster, they might use an iPad to create a story about a solution to the problem. They might make an animated video of how to solve the problem and take it back to the main character in the story and say, this is what you need to do to solve this problem. But all of the time, the children are playing, but what they're doing is bringing those concepts in to service that play. So the more problems that arise, the more STEM concepts can be learned, and that in turn makes the play more complex. So if you're interested to be a part of what we're doing, we would just love it so much. And if you haven't filled in the survey, please do. feel free to email. You can see the email address there if you would like to be involved as part of this international work that we're doing. And we're also hoping to provide some professional development that will be translated into Mandarin as well. So stay tuned for that as well. So thank you very much, and I will stop sharing and pass back to Vivian or whoever else is going to, is it Jenny maybe?
Thank you so much, Professor Fleer, for sharing with us about the conceptual play worlds. And I think the idea of imaginary play is definitely interesting. And the conceptual play worlds provided an excellent framework for those teachers who are afraid of hijacking play, which is a very common issue for play-based learning teachers, I think. And the talk is very fruitful, and we have all learned a lot from it, I am sure of it. And we actually have some questions, some very wonderful questions came in already. And let's start with the first one. And the first one is coming from a very wonderful teacher as well, Ms. Rebecca Tupling, and she asked, she's coming from a PYP background, and she has seen many disciplinary connections between the curriculum and skills. And she liked to know how, Professor Fleer, you start with an authentic problem before the planning for the students to discover. And how would you recommend documenting the learning that is occurring during these activities?
Oh, that's a beautiful question. So how to document the learning? Oh, it's just the documentation. I didn't share any of that. The documentation in the play worlds is really rich, because when the teachers and the children jump out of the play world, they have to do some research. And so first of all, we do a lot of mind mapping. So we have big sheets of butcher's paper, and the children talk about what they know and how they might solve the problem. So you get and you write the names of each child or groups of children on the sheets to say who said what about this problem. And it gives but also it's really good, because when another child hears the other child say something, it triggers something that they know or a question that they have. So what we do is we document it on the large sheets. That's one way we do it. Another way we do it, and you saw a little example of that in the video, we ask the children to reflect on their learning. What did they learn, and about, in this case, symbiotic relationships. And you saw the children were drawing pictures, and some of them could write what they'd learned and others could only draw, and so the teacher can scribe. So in the Play Worlds approach, it does give the possibility to do the individual documentation and the collective documentation, but also when the children are solving the problem, they're also coming up with solutions. So if they make an animation, a video animation, they have to really think through how do I show a symbiotic relationship if I'm going to make a video of it? So do I use the same characters? If I take a photo and I do a narration on it, how do I show that relationship? So they have to really make conscious what they know. And as they're doing that, the teacher can, of course, document that learning of the children, how they're trying to solve that problem by presenting it, but also they have the product to look at later as well. So where they can see where they might need to plan next. So, okay, all of the children may not have completely understood this concept. What can I do next? What other problem can I introduce? So that's an example of that kind of documentation. And then, of course, there are standardized tests and things that, different systems use. I don't know what Hong Kong uses, if Hong Kong uses anything. But if you have particular things there, then it's looking at what are the components. If there's something about reflection or wondering, imagination, what might be the sort of higher order 21st century skills that we might see. And of course, then you can use your standard approach to doing that kind of assessment as well.
Thank you very much to Professor Fleer for your wonderful answers to such an amazing question. However, due to the time limit, I'm afraid we can't ask all the other questions. We will save the other questions to our panel discussion. Thank you very much for all the great questions.
Thank you.
My pleasure.